Hello, good friends. I've been thinking a lot this afternoon. I'm not from the north of England, so I didn't say I've been thinking a lot. I pronounced my TH correctly. I'm sorry, it might be me. I've been thinking a lot this afternoon. You know, you could pronounce things however you want, but if you're going to be deliberately lazy, come on now. I don't give anybody a pass in being deliberately lazy with their pronunciation. Because my father didn't allow people to be deliberately lazy with their pronunciation. Because in the home as he was growing up, English was not necessarily spoken very much in the home. So that's one of the compliments he gave me as I was growing up. At least you can speak English. At least you can write English. He admired me for being able to speak English, although it is not perhaps the King's English. However, listen, folks, if you're just going to be sloppy in one area, you're going to be sloppy in other areas if you get into the habit of being sloppy. In fact, when I was trying to learn German in high school, obviously I'm not fluent. Sprechen Sie Deutsch? Ja, ja. I can speak German as well as an intelligent 2-year-old, perhaps. When grammatical concepts when they attempted to explain grammatical concepts to us about the German language, it was very difficult because by the time I got to high school, we don't even know how our own language works. We don't even understand a predicate adjective, a direct object, things like that. People are very honorific with regard to other languages, but not the English language. Is it just some sort of like a garbage can language? I mean, why be sloppy about anything? Do it as well as you can. Even if you study all night and you get a C plus on your math test, at least you know you've done as well as you could, correct? One time I did stay up. Well, I stayed up late and I studied for a math test and I got a C plus, and I'm so proud of that to this day. Even though my mother was a math teacher, she really wasn't able to help me much with math. Maybe she wasn't interested, or I'm not really sure if we didn't have the proper rapport. Certainly I didn't have the foundation that I needed to get an A in that class. But when I got that C plus, and I told my best friend, I got a C plus, she said, well, I could even do that without even studying. I'm like, at first my feelings were hurt, but I'm still, to this day, I know how hard I studied for it. But I had a particular vulnerability in that I had been moved from school district to school district, which disrupted my mathematical education. It really did. I mean, if you don't have that firm foundation, then you try to build the subsequent stories on top of the house and the foundation is shaky sometimes. The house is going to be a little bit crooked, kind of like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, I guess. But I thought, it's very important. I always wanted to somehow get my opinion out there. Somehow. Well, if I looked as pretty as, some of these people, like the press secretary, or if I was this man with connections that had a high testosterone level and I was super duper smart and super duper tall, perhaps I would have a larger audience. But if I even have one person listening, then that must be the person who should be listening. Because after all, didn't God give us one mouth, 2 eyes, and 2 ears? Before we speak, we're supposed to listen and we're supposed to observe. In fact, we should observe 4 times as much as we talk. But I have been observing a lot. And I've said this before, and perhaps I've delivered the message in a way that has not been well received, or perhaps it has not been as clear or compassionate as it might have been, folks. My dear friends, do you realize if you parents were married, if you're just the typical American Christian, I don't care what race you are, you kind of are sliding into that minority category if your parents were ever married in the first place. Isn't that a little bit... I mean, doesn't it give you pause? Doesn't it give you reason to think about... Think? You should have said think. No, I said think. Think. I'm sorry, am I showing off? Am I being mean? If people from other religions and other cultures that you're not quite comfortable with have a lower divorce rate, and having children out of wedlock for them is taboo, why is it so acceptable in American Christian society? And some people are going to get mad and say, I'm being judgmental. What do you think God's plan is? For people just to be like street animals and to breed in alleys and, just give birth to litters and then just move on with their lives and maybe meet up again? I mean, that's not, people shouldn't behave like animals. And too many American Christians behave that way. And I'm not saying any race in particular. It's rather shameful. You have a male preacher saying this from the pulpit, even a female preacher. I don't know that they could even keep their congregation, but I don't have a church. I hope that I do have some listeners, however. I wanted to keep my message pretty simple. Why you should have great doubts about divorcing your spouse. Let's approach it that way, because there are different ways that I can approach this. But I want to say this about my parents. They did divorce briefly, but then they subsequently remarried. But the reason for the divorce... I don't want to smear anybody's reputation, but I'm telling you, during the 1970s, there was this women's liberation movement. Women, first you had your sexual freedom, which was pushed in the 1960s. You can sleep around all you want. You should get on birth control, and then things like that. So you could be just like a man, you could sleep around, and you didn't have to worry about getting pregnant. But what did you have to worry about? Well, possibly getting a venereal disease. That's the least of your worries, perhaps. But my parents' divorce occurred at a time when in the culture, divorce was extremely popular, and women's rights. Remember the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment? No, I'm sorry, I am one of those people. No, you don't even say it. You can alienate your audience. Okay, I'll be quiet. I will be quiet because we don't want to overshare, of course. But women are more emotional, and they tend to be more compassionate, which is our nature, and we are more likely to be swayed by emotional appeals than men are. I mean, most women are not really looking for the things that young women and younger women are not looking for the things that men are looking for. I mean, women want protection, women want comfort, women want validation, women want appreciation. And I'm not saying that men don't want validation and appreciation, but they want something that George Michael talked about. You know, I mean, that's the nature of the male animal. Am I incorrect? And I'm using that in a metaphorical way. I was born in a different generation. I didn't mean that to be insulting. Emotional comfort isn't as important to most men as it is to women. But women are looking for validation and comfort and protection, and sometimes they find it in a way that's, well, it's not marriage, but it sure seems like it approximates Prince Charming, correct? And from the time I was a little girl, you know, I saw the Disney movies. I saw the original Cinderella, yeah, and the original Snow White and Sleeping Beauty, everything like that. There was always this valiant prince that would appear on the scene to rescue the damsel in distress. And the message, one of the messages that those sorts of Disney movies taught us was that men could be trusted. That if they really seemed to be interested in your welfare, then they would never ever let you down, they would never betray you. That would be all you needed to do was find a good man, right? Just listen to Janis Joplin. Piece of my heart. I mean, I'm sorry, Janis Joplin didn't have an ideal life. We know that. I'm not saying she was the paragon of Christian virtue, but in the middle of my mom had the album, you know, Janis Joplin Live. All you ever need to do, bro, is be a good man one time to one woman, and that'll be the end of the road. You know. I think she was kind of looking for her Prince Charming, too. That didn't, unfortunately, her life didn't seem to end on a positive note. Let's be honest, folks. No, but we're not to judge somebody that was destroyed by the music industry and fame. Many people have been warped and destroyed and put through the meat grinder by fame. I realize that. Who am I to judge? Who am I to judge? Who am I to judge? I have to say, even though I might be critical, I might make some criticisms, I might make some judgments. That is to say, is this right or is this wrong? There's a difference between saying, okay, this is right and this is wrong, and saying, well, that person doesn't deserve any mercy. I never would have done that if I were that person. There used to be a saying that Christians had there, but for the grace of God go I. And so, returning back to the subject of my parents' divorce, what I might have done if I had been in my mother's shoes, it's really impossible for me to say, but I understand why she made the choice that she did. It was, she had a lot of pressure, cultural pressure, and then pressure from peers. You know, peer pressure affects adults too, even in professional circles. And should I say especially in professional circles? Peer pressure is very, very instrumental in our decision making when we do not have a solid foundation, what's right, what's wrong, not in a clear understanding, and I would say even a trust in God and His Word. Because, dear friends, my mother was a practicing Catholic, and I think she faithfully took me every Sunday for Mass, and I had my first communion, and my dad only occasionally would attend church, just for special times like Easter and Christmas. Most of the time he wasn't sure that he bought into the whole religion thing, so it's almost as if you could call it an interfaith marriage. But the few years that I was a Catholic and my mother was taking me, I was very happy. I thought it was just such a wonderful thing every time we went to church. I had a good experience. Not every child did, and I'm sorry for that. So it made it so, all the more surprising when suddenly my mother told me, not that long after giving birth to my brother, it totally took me by surprise, folks, that she and father were getting a divorce, and it wasn't clear whose decision it was to get the divorce. I was really absolutely taken by surprise. I knew that my parents didn't always get along, and I knew that there was a guy hanging around on the periphery that was a little too friendly with my mother. I knew that, but I trusted that it was just a close friendship. I'll never have the chance to ask her. Once we're in heaven, we're going to forget about all the worldly stuff anyway, and all our troubles and pain and sorrows. But while my mother was still alive, I never really had the chance to ask her in just an honest way. I didn't have the courage to ask her. I didn't have the emotional wherewithal to ask her, why did you do it, Mom? What? I know the guy was very seductive, but did you, what led you down that primrose path toward an unhappy chapter in both of our lives, really, I would say? Because it wasn't that long after my mother and my father divorced that my mother acquired breast cancer, and she had to go through chemotherapy and everything. It was very frightening, and it turned out that that romantic partner that seemed to be the Prince Charming, if he ever took her to a chemotherapy treatment, I don't know. That man vanished off the scene pretty quickly after my parents' divorce. Really sad, but here's the part where I talk about myself, and I don't think it makes me a narcissist, because if I can share my experiences with you, then you can understand how if I can tell what happened to me, then you might be able to relate to it. Perhaps you can repent, or perhaps you can prevent doing this thing unwittingly to your own child. But it seems to me now, certainly in retrospect, that I moved around a lot when I was a little girl, because my mother had the financial pressures. She wasn't a single mother, but she had the financial pressures of having to go to work. And so I would go to one babysitter, and I would get very comfortable there, and then all of a sudden I'd be moved to another babysitter, and then yet again another babysitter. And that was difficult because I was making friends with the other children, whether they were the babysitters' sons and daughters, or whether they were other children that were being babysat. Every time I started to really feel secure in a certain place. It seems as if all of a sudden, without warning, oh, it's time to go somewhere else. I don't really have a good explanation for that, and that's another thing that perhaps I'll never know. And by the time I get to heaven, I'll forget about all that stuff. This happened even after I entered school and I was making friends in school. All of a sudden, well, it's time to move. One of the things must have been financial pressures. Well, it's going to be a lot cheaper if we live here, if we go to this babysitter or this, or, it's like, oh my goodness. It was pretty devastating when I lost my best friend in the middle of first grade. Right after Christmas, without warning, we moved to this very cold place, and I had had a very nice kindergarten teacher. No, I'm sorry, first grade teacher. Whereas I had had a very mean kindergarten teacher the previous year in a different school district. Then suddenly I had a really nice kindergarten teacher that I really loved. And I felt so secure in that class, and I had a friend, a best friend and everything, and then all of a sudden, psh, now it's time to move, And this new teacher, she was just mean as could be. She was the total opposite of the other teacher that I had before Christmas. I'm not trying to whine, folks, but I'm trying to tell you, the little girl couldn't speak up on behalf of herself, but I'm speaking on behalf of the other little girls that can't speak. Because some of them can't, and they won't be able to articulate this to you. And if you ask them, they might not want to hurt your feelings and tell you the truth. But this is the truth. And you can hear me. I'm not judgmental. I'm just, I'm sad. I'm sad about that. And it really took several years for me to become reacclimated, more than 3 years actually, to this new school district. At first, the new kid is not accepted many times in school districts. At least that's the way it used to be. But I had found the place. I became familiar enough to the families. My family became familiar enough to the kids' families, and I became familiar enough to my classmates that they started to accept me. At first I was bullied, that's for sure. I was bullied beginning in the first grade by that teacher. What was wrong with that woman? I'm sure I looked like a deer in the headlights. Maybe that's why she hated me so much. But it had been a rough road, but I had made another best friend, and I had gained acceptance amongst my peers. I was no longer an outsider, and then all of a sudden, then my mom says, your father and I are getting a divorce. And then it was just, when I look back at it, in fact, I had a chance, I'm sorry, this is just going to have to be part one, because this is so long-winded. I had a chance to drive through some of these areas where I used to live today, just really a little bit by accident. And I just kept having this recurring feeling of sadness. Like, I had good friends, and I had good friends, and I'm not trying to say this in a mean way, and I'm going to try to be as nice as possible, but after my parents' divorce, where we moved, it's just like the people, again, I have the problem with outsiders, being an outsider, not that I considered them outsiders, but here you are, an outsider suddenly thrown into a strange school district, and it's very disorienting. But on top of it, they just seem to be super nasty, and then as the years go on, there's a problem with morality. That's all I can, it's like the people, you wouldn't know from the landscape that these people seem to be nasty. I was bullied, I'm promiscuous and engaging in substance abuse. I mean, I'm talking about underage girls. There was no foreign people around, folks, so don't blame any foreign people, please. Underage girls doing what I knew was wrong. We're supposed to be a Christian society. They're having, sex with men that are in their late teens or in their 20s or even beyond, folks. I mean, even married men, girls who are my peers, girls who are my age. There was just a lot of that. There was that spirit of promiscuity and substance abuse in that new school district. So I have to say, I really think that the connections that I had made before my parents' divorce were better in terms of, not that I'm being a snob, but I do believe that I had a firmer foundation, that those families, most of those families, and obviously the parents of my peers were not doing that sort of thing. It was a different culture. And it wasn't even a different country. All it was a different county, really. America, if you're not American, you don't understand. If you didn't have my life, then maybe you don't understand. But someday I hope somebody will leave a comment and say something and say, hey, I had a similar experience and I totally understand. And I don't judge and I forgive anybody that was mean to me, but I was really subjected to a lot of stuff that was pretty traumatizing. Before, but especially after my parents' divorce. When you're fair game and people can start bullying you and you're entering puberty and then you begin to feel insecure about your looks, whereas you really didn't care that much before, at least that's the way it used to be. And I can tell you, neither of my parents experienced, my dad did have to move from the east side of one town to the west side during his childhood, but I think that happened one time. My parents had no idea what I was going through. They were just so focused on making money, I'm not saying that making money is wrong, but sadly, money was a bigger focus than it ought to have been. So I'm not pointing the finger of blame at either one, or it's just so terribly sad. I mean, sad because I think of how, I was really making friends. I had really good friends. I would talk to them for hours on the phone, both boys and girls, before my parents' divorce. And some of their parents were good parents. They were solid. They weren't slackers. I'm not saying that they were these massively wealthy people, but after moving, I never was able to make friends with the well-off people. Not that don't get me wrong, but I was bullied by the well-off people, or just left alone as if I was some sort of like a curious entity or something, a curiosity. I mean, it's, how that feels? Do you know how that feels? It wasn't a racial thing, it's just a clannish thing. That's a problem. And if not for that divorce, I truly believe that my life would have been better, and I think my brother would still be alive if not for that divorce. It was like crossing the Rubicon, but it was good for Julius Caesar, bad for me and my family. Beware, beware, beware. Thank you for listening. Adios.